first event this semester in the Tocqueville Lecture Series program, which is co-hosted by the Ostrom Workshop at Indiana University in Bloomington. And I'm delighted to welcome today Professor Stephen Teles. Before I introduce Stephen, I'd like to introduce myself. For those of you who might not have met me, I'm Aurelian Craiuțu, and I'm a professor in Department of Political Science, and I co-direct with Professor Les Lenkowski the small program called the Tocqueville program, which this semester is looking at re-examining again the idea of America and the future of American democracy. So that's the reason for including in our first meeting Professor Stephen Teles, who is Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University and Senior Fellow at the Niskanen Center, where I also serve as Senior Fellow. Stephen is the author of several books, most recently Never Trump, The Revolt of the Conservative Elites, The Rise of the Conservative Legal Moment, as well as a number of other books. He writes regularly for popular outlets such as the New York Times, National Affairs, Democracy Journal, and the Washington Monthly. Stephen has kindly agreed to speak to us about an essay that he published in National Affairs, The Future is Faction, Reconstructing America's Party in an Unstable Era, which was posted for advanced reading on the website of the Ostrom Workshop. Stephen will receive a response from my colleague, Professor Stephen Webster, who joined the Department of Political Science at Indiana recently. Stephen has just published a widely commented and very well received book on anger in American politics. Stephen has accepted my invitation to give this response, after which we'll have a question and answers period. We will end promptly at 1:30, so I would try to monitor the conversation and give the room to as many people that want to ask any questions. We will use the chat room, and we will be following probably 2 or 3 questions at the same time to give more people a chance to ask questions. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Teles. And Stephen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. So again, the last 5 minutes have been terrifying, as I've been going back and forth with my wife saying, I'm giving the most important talk of my life. And like the Wi-Fi is out. So again, it's an honor, really is an honor actually to be invited by Les and Aurelian. Les I've known, I've talked to Les a number of times where I have had to have him explain things very slowly to me so that I understood often complicated events in the history. Les, I think, is a little bit like Zelig, who's been, he's been there in history, all kinds of different points, certainly in my own research. And Aurelian is kind of the spirit animal at the Niskanen Center where I'm affiliated. People often answer questions by asking, what would Aurelian think about this? So, it's an honor to be invited. Also, I was looking at the Zoom, and there are all these like other people. I was like, oh my God, Julia Azari is on this call. That's awesome. So anyways, I should get into the talk. So this paper that you read was originally the conclusion for my book, Never Trump, with Rob Saldine at the University of Montana. And it's kind of morphed over time into something that has an existence apart from that larger book. And the that conclusion came out of partially my frustration with book conclusions in general, which are almost always disappointing. And so we kind of decided, why don't we actually just say something that's well beyond the 4 corners of the book that the person's already read, right? Why don't we actually give them something that tries to think well beyond that in a kind of speculative vein. And so this paper is highly speculative, right? It's kind of an exercise in futurism, which, again, one of the advantages of that is you can say a lot of things about futurism without fear of falsification. So I'll just get started. But again, remember that this started from that book, Never Trump. And if we have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. Okay. So one way to think about this paper is to think about it as about how do we deal politically with the fact of ideological heterogeneity, right? We become very used to talking about political identities in polarized left, right, liberal, conservative ways. We have lots of organization and infrastructure that's built around those fairly narrow ways of describing our political identities. But that single, what political scientists call single dimensional issue space, is obviously too confining to express the actual ways that either the ideology or the interests of the public manifest themselves. Now, for many democratic citizens, ideology is not even the most salient identity that they bring to politics, right? We have professions, we have religion, we have region, we have migration status, right? All of those are rivals for the most important and most salient political identity around which we might organize. And in most parts of the world, this heterogeneity manifests itself in the form of multiple parties. So I was going over, just in preparation for this, I was going over looking at the political parties of Holland, just as an example, not a very big country, 17 million people. But Holland starts out, when you look at their parties, they have a sort of standard issue right of center party, a standard issue left of center party, but they also have a strong center party, a populist party, a socialist party, a green party, a socially conservative party, a socially liberal party, and of course, the Party for Animals, an actual party that actually has seats in the Dutch legislature. And that does not exhaust the parties that have representation in the Dutch political system, right? And for me, it's hard to believe that the United States has less fundamental political heterogeneity than do 17 million Dutch people. But for institutional reasons, primarily, sorry, we have only two parties. And that has been a pretty durable equilibrium for over a century and a half. Now, as Dan DeSalvo has argued in his book, Engines of Change, what we have instead of those multiple parties is a history of factions, right? Organized, coordinated groups within parties that provide an outlet for some of that heterogeneity that can't be manifest through multiple parties, right? So think about the history of American politics. You can tell it in part as a history of party factions. Southern Democrats are the most obvious one, right? But also Rockefeller Republicans, progressives in both parties in the first part of the 20th century, stalwarts, mugwumps, radical Republicans, ACA liberals, DLC moderate Democrats. And of course, on top of that, we have interest groups that, while not representing a faction as such, operate primarily within one party rather than the other in the form of a kind of internal coalition. So the 2 decades from the mid-90s to the mid-2010s, on the contrast, was really distinctive in American history in the relative absence of this kind of factional conflict, right? We had the death of moderate Republicans as a distinct organization. You had the decline of the Democratic Leadership Council and the Democratic Party. And one way to think about what we mean when we say polarization is that we have increasing party internal homogeneity. Not only are the parties moving further apart, but the members are growing more similar to one another, right? At least in the legislature, and we'll come back to that in the later. Related to that, homogeneity means less demand for organized factions to coordinate the distinct preferences of members, which is what factions are. Factions provide an outlet for the projection of those distinct heterogeneous interests inside of a party. Right? So I thought about this, and Rob and I thought about this in the context of a larger literature in political science called conditional party government theory. And that theory, which people who do Congress know very well, was primarily individualistic, right? It was about heterogeneity, but at the individual member of Congress level. But it works for thinking about organized heterogeneity in the form of factions as well. And conditional party government theory, which we associate with John Aldrich and David Rhodey, emphasize that homogeneous members, right, members who are more or less similar to one another, means strong leadership, and heterogeneous members means weaker leadership, less control of the agenda from the center, and more power to members, right? So the more alike members are, the more they're going to be willing to transfer power over to their leaders, because you don't face the same agency cost that you do if you've got really heterogeneous members, where you're going to worry that your leader will do something different than what you would do if you were in that position, right? So thinking about the last 2 decades in this way makes us think about conditional party government theory in some new ways. But another implication of it is that in a factional framework, heterogeneous members means greater demand for organization to coordinate that heterogeneity, right? The more members are different from one another, the more they're going to want to organize together in order to press that heterogeneity on leaders, to constrain leaders, to make demands as a group, right? And conditional party government theory classically predicted that more power, to committees in a heterogeneous Congress, but it should also imply moving power out to negotiations between factions, right? So one prediction is, in a heterogeneous Congress, you devolve power down to committees who can organize some of that heterogeneity, but it also would imply moving power out to factions and to have party decision-making not so much be hierarchical, but be kind of lateral and coalitional. So a heterogeneous Congress is one in which parties operate as coalitions of factions that negotiate with one another, as well as negotiating with factions across party lines, right? The more you have internal party heterogeneity with organized factions, the more those organized factions are going to demand, as a condition of working with their party leaders, that they also be able to work with factions on the other party who they may share significant amounts of preference overlap. Okay. A homogeneous Congress, on the other hand, implies stronger leadership, but partially because of the absence of a factional structure to force leadership to negotiate, right? The reason that leaders in a homogeneous Congress can govern more or less unilaterally is they don't have some organization saying that we as a group will all defect if you try and run this as a top-down organization, right? So it's not just a kind of individual member preference thing, as you saw in conditional party government theory, but now an organized structure. Okay. So what are the problem with factionless parties, right? One is that while there's been some polarization in the mass public, there is general agreement, I think, in the literature that there has not been the same degree of polarization in the mass public as there has been in members of Congress or in party elites, right? The Congress that the public sees does not reflect their actual distribution of opinion, does not reflect the actual heterogeneity of their own opinion. In particular, it doesn't reflect the parts of the public that are cross-pressured, right? So you think about people who are economically liberal or socially conservative, right? Or they're economically conservative and socially liberal. Those people are the ones who are most likely to not see themselves represented in any systematic way in Congress. And a Congress without factions has no mechanism to force leadership to share power with members, right? Has no way that members can actually force that leadership to actually decentralize power, to actually give more role for members. As a consequence, there's less for members to do, right? So I've talked to members of Congress, and you go to the Capitol Hill Club, which I've done a couple of times, and the remarkable thing is there's just not that much for people to do, right? In a very top-down Congress, the job of the average member of Congress is to vote however leadership tells them to do, and then go on cable TV and talk about how awful the other party is, right? That literally is the job description for the overwhelming percentage of members of Congress. And so in that sense, right, there are strong incentives for negative partisanship built into this model of Congress, because again, doing negative partisanship, acting on it, talking about how scary the other party is the thing you can do if there isn't a thing for you to do in terms of actual legislating. And so negative partisanship is therefore connected to the absence of cross-party coalitions due to leadership discipline, because it means individual members know that they don't need members on the other side, right? There's nothing that they want that they need to do for their own either ideological or re-election interests, where they're going to want some relationship with members of that other party to be able to do it. So therefore, there's no cost to attacking that other party with every ounce of energy you have. You don't need to hold anything back because you're worried that you're going to need that person later on. And so a factionless Congress with strong leadership will only take up issues that mostly unify the majority caucus and divide them from the opposition, right? Except, as Phil Wallach has argued, under crisis conditions, right? So it turns out that we actually have crisis bipartisanship. But other than that, other than when the whole system seems to be about to collapse, we have no way of actually creating cross-party coalitions. And that leads to an agenda dominated by polarizing issues, right? Because the polarizing issues are the one that leadership wants on the agenda, right? They don't want issues where their members are internally divided. Okay. A further implication of what I've just argued is that in a Congress like that, a factionless Congress, politicians who have an actual taste for legislating will either not run for Congress or will retire, right? Because there's simply no opportunity for them to do actual legislating, right? And because they don't have a taste for going on Fox News or MSNBC and attacking the other party, there's literally no part of the current job description that they want to act on. And I was talking to Les about this on email a little while ago, right? That's why we see more systematic retirement of those kinds of members, right? Because this is the kind of Congress that's going to be least satisfying for them, right? The other implication is that it will be very difficult for dissenting members of the party to maintain a minority position, right? One thing we saw with the more Trump skeptical members of the Republican Party is that they all got picked off one by one, right? Whether Bob Corker or Jeff Flake, right? It was easy for party leaders and people, in this case, Donald Trump, to isolate them and then destroy them, right? In a way that it wouldn't be if they were actually organized into some structure for collective action. Okay, so that's the bad news, and that's like a lot of bad news. In fact, there's even more bad news in what I just said than was in the actual paper. So I gave you extra bad news because we're in COVID and we're in bad news all the time. Okay, but the paper was actually designed to be optimistic, right? Generally, political scientists, I think, are better at describing, people often say that economics is the dismal science, but actually I think political science is the dismal science, because we're better at talking about how, you can get downward cycles or self-reinforcing kind of equilibria that are hard to break out of, right? But our argument in the paper is that this largely factionless party system may be at the breaking point, right? If you want to get out, if you want to think about what are the ways to solve many of the really big governing systemic problems we have, right? Our argument is there's no way to do it without a more heterogeneous party system, a party system that's manifested in a lot of internal factions, right? But the mechanism for breaking that system, right, the system that's generating such enormous ramping up of polarization to the point of where, it's becoming, nearly an armed kind of struggle, is not going to be clever institutional changes in the rules, right? So there's been lots of people who thought, oh, well, the way we're going to get more moderates is we're going to have ranked choice voting, right? And a lot of this paper was actually originally written for people who were moderates like me and Aurelian to say, please stop spending all your time trying to get ranked choice voting. Because in a way, a lot of that energy is all trying to find a way to solve this problem without solving the underlying mobilization and organization problem that creates it, right? The fundamental reason why actors on the polls are so much more powerful in the system, we argue, is they show up, right? They organize, right? In the old term, they educate, organize, educate, educate, and organize, and moderates don't, right? And there's no clever institutional rule thing around that basic problem of organizational disequilibrium, right? And then say Aurelian's gonna like give me a hand up when I'm about to run out of my time, but I think I got 10 minutes more, right? Okay. So the process, we argue, by which we'll see greater factionalization, or at least the opportunity for greater factionalization, will be triggered, we argue, by two forces. One is the reverberating impact of the existing, what we call DSA or left or squad faction, right? That, we argue, their organization into a factional form is going to create at least very strong incentives for lots of other actors to organize in response, right? And I think the actual events of the Capitol riot, building on some of the already building sort of tensions inside the Republican Party, may also create some of the conditions for more factional organization. Okay. So let's start with, again, what I'm calling the DSA faction, which you don't have to call it that. You can call it something else. Just to let you know, I'm pouring myself coffee as I'm talking because we're in COVID and we can do things like that. So I'm starting with the this DSA left faction because it is the most obviously, clearly factionally organized group in our system, right? It has all the things that a classic party faction has, right? One, it has candidate recruitment, right? That's distinct from the rest of the party, right? So that left wing is out there trying to find candidates who are associated with its brand. They're running them in primaries, right? Like Cori Bush. That's one thing that a party faction does, is that it actually contests for the party brand internally rather than deferring to the decisions of party leaders, right? It has separate systems of funding, right? It has, again, you think about the way that the Bernie Sanders campaign raised money, right? It's got entirely separate people who are being brought in through different networks, who are being appealed to in different ways. And so they can raise money for candidates separate from the way that the rest of the party is raising money, right? It has distinct branding, right? It actually can brand its members as DSA or left or whatever candidates, right? And they run as such, right? Fourth, right, again, participation in primaries. Fifth, alternative policy development, right? So this DSA faction has its own, increasing its own interest groups, its own think tanks, right, who are producing ideas that are distinct to that party brand, right? They have their own magazines. They have, God, do they have a lot of magazines? You know, N+1, Jacobin, current events. They have all these magazines where also members can communicate to one another, right? To give that, and that gives them not only ideas, but a shared sort of ritual of belonging, right? They're all reading the same magazines. It has common coordinating interests, right? It has mechanisms for the various parts of that faction to communicate with one another and to engage in strategy. And again, I think they're at the beginning of forcing leadership to engage in structured negotiation with them as a way of organizing the legislature, right? That's the one thing we'll see when we really see a full-flowered factional structure, right? Is that the party leadership will have to, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or whoever comes after her, will have to run Congress in a way where she has to go and ask that faction what they want, right? What is it we can all agree on, so that it's not simply the negotiation of the leadership with individual members, but it's a kind of structured negotiation. Okay. So that's happening, right? And again, we're already seeing many of the signs of that, right? All of the primary challenge, the successful primary challenges are a suggestion that we're actually fairly far into that process, right? But what happens when a faction like that emerges, right? One of the basic insights of political science, right, is you disturb one part of a system and the other parts of the system then then react, right? That is, there's a new kind of equilibrium that's going to get generated. And one of the ways that's going to happen, again, is this mechanism through primarying mainstream Democrats, right? Every mainstream Democrat, Biden Democrat, however you want to describe it, right, is now on alert, right, that they could be challenged in a primary, right? That's somewhere in their head, right? And increasingly, what that's going to do is make it hard for members to straddle the divide between these factions, right? Increasingly, they're going to have to choose either we throw ourselves in with the DSA faction, right? And we work with them, and that keeps us from having a primary challenge, right? Or we mainstream Democrats are going to have to get together and organize in order to protect ourselves from those kinds of challenges, right? And so those mainstream Democrats who until yesterday thought they just were the party, right, are now going to have to organize in distinctly factional ways simply as a mechanism of self-protection, right? The second is that the toxicity of the DSA brand in less blue places, right? The DSA brand is perfectly fine in the district that Cori Bush ran in or the district that AOC ran in, but it's a real problem, right? And you saw this immediately after the election. Abby Spanberger came out and unloaded both barrels at the DSA faction because she was saying that was, people were associating that brand with the Democrats as a whole, and that was going to have damage for people who are running in less blue places, right? The more that's true, the more there's an incentive for those people in purple places to organize distinctly to say, don't think about AOC when you think about the Democratic Party, think about you voting for an Abby Spanberger Democrat, which is a distinct brand that people know, but there you have to actually invest to create that brand. You need collective action to create that brand, right? So we argue that together, what's going to happen is the Abby Spanbergers are going to have to organize a distinct brand. They may have to go and resuscitate like Frankenstein, the dead carcass of the DLC, to bring it back to life, to give them that distinct brand. The mainstream Democrats are going to have to organize in more factional ways. And together, what you're going to have, again, is a more deeply organized factional structure inside of the Democratic Party, in which those factions are then going to have to create some structured, organized, institutional way to make decisions that is going to be a relatively weak leadership role, right? The role of leadership is going to be brokering those factional divisions rather than determining the agenda from the top. Okay. What about the Republican Party? And this is where I'll end because I'm running out of time. The DSA faction also, interestingly enough, has implications for the Republican Party, right? Because pushing the Democratic Party to the left in blue states and cities opens up space for Republicans where they may not have been competitive before, right? The more that left wing of the Democratic Party in New York City or Massachusetts or places like that continues to try and push the party to nominate people who are well to the left, that creates a kind of Downsian opening if there's a Republican Party that can sufficiently detoxify its brand in places like that. Again, like the Abby Spanberger Democrats, if they can say, I'm a liberal conservative Republican, right? I'm not like those, gun-toting, Christian nationalists you may have heard of, right? I'm something else, right? And, I am, and you can see some of the potential for that already in Maryland and Massachusetts, right? Where those candidates, those governors ran more or less on an individual brand, right? They ran by saying, I know you don't like the left of the Democratic Party, right? You want to have a Democratic legislature, but you want adult supervision in the governor's house, right? That's essentially how they run. increasingly, I think those kinds of people are going to have to create something beyond just their individual brand, right? They're going to have to say that, there's a broader, distinct Republican brand that's appropriate for purple places, right? And there's an opening the further the Democratic Party goes to the left, right? So I think increasingly there's demand for that. There's demand for a liberal conservative faction that also is generated by the fact that the further the Republican Party economically goes in a populist direction, the more the core business interests of the Republican Party are going to be uncomfortable endorsing the Republican Party as such, right? And they can provide both the money and organization and other things for what I think is going to be a minority, but often pivotal liberal conservative faction. Okay. The last thing I'll say is I think there may in fact be a feedback from January 6th, right? That event is going to affect the agenda of the entire American political system, I think in ways we haven't entirely processed yet. Just as 9/11 put the whole issue of terrorism in the Middle East at the center of the party conflict for years to come, right? It may be that both the events of January 6th, the things that will come after, right? I don't think January 6th is the end of that kind of thing, and the state response to it, what I think we can just call repression, right? Except I'm in a position of saying repression maybe is not so bad. But a lot of our political system is going to polarize around that activity and whatever state repression may be necessary in order to deal with it. And you can imagine that part of what is going to distinguish the liberal conservative faction is it's going to be the pro-repression part of the Republican Party, right? Whereas the dominant populist faction will not only be distinguished in economic terms, but may be defined by its protection of, or its at least ambivalence toward the sort of state repression of the more armed part of the conservative movement. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I got a lot more if I wanted to provide it, but I think that's one of the arguments that if that happens, right, if you start seeing those factional divides, then there are an enormous number of knock-on effects, right? First, there will be very strong incentives for party factions to insist on very different ways of organizing Congress. Much weaker central control, much weaker agenda control, right? Those party factions are going to want to be able to work with parties on the other side, and they're going to be able to demand that they do so because they're going to be able to use their pivotal power in order to organize Congress in order to get it, right? As I argued before, the equilibrium effect of that is also going to be to potentially change the kind of people who run for Congress, right? Because a Congress where part of your job is making entrepreneurial, strange bedfellows coalitions is going to attract a different kind of person than is attracted now. The more there's that, the more you may see feedback in the organization outside of Congress, right? Right now, think tanks have not been doing so much of the kind of work that they used to do of trying to come up with ideas that might have strange bedfellows, transpartisan coalitions in the way that deregulation did in the 1970s or tax reform did in the 1980s or welfare reform like Les worked on had in the 80s and 90s. There's been less demand for that, but you can imagine the more Congress is demanding or providing opportunities for transpartisan cross-party coalitions, the more you might see more supply of those ideas from the outside. Okay, that's where I'll stop and take.
Thank you, Stephen. It's my pleasure to welcome Stephen Webster, a short response to Professor Teles, and after that, Stephen, after that, you will have a chance to respond briefly to Stephen's points, and I'd like to remind people to send a request in chat for questions. Stephen.
Thank you. Well, thank you for sending us this paper, Stephen. It was very interesting, and I greatly enjoyed reading it. There's three sort of broad things I want to touch on just briefly on each. The first thing is I think there's a bit of an unspoken assumption in the piece, and that's that this logic of perhaps an emerging leftist or DSA faction of the Democratic Party is a linear trend, right? So right now, the DSA is in the news, it's sort of in vogue, but there's not a whole lot of DSA affiliated members in Congress, right? We have the Squad, perhaps Cori Bush, and so we have really probably 5 DSA members in the Democratic caucus. And so one question I have is whether we think the DSA is going to continue to get more people elected, or whether they're sort of a function of the times that we're in, right? Because if there isn't a continual growth in this faction, it's not clear to me that what you describe as the Biden wing of the Democratic caucus will really have to respond to the DSA, right? It appears to be the case that factions have to be of a certain size and perhaps of a relatively equal size for them to really be able to engage in the bargaining that you discuss in your piece. And so one question I have is, A, do we think the DSA will continue to grow at the level we're seeing now? And B, do the factions need to be of a relatively equal size? I think where we might see the trends that you describe in the piece is actually on the Republican side. So this is sort of contra the Grossman and Hopkins stories about the Democrats being more heterogeneous. I think we might see the rise of some factions on the right, right? So you discuss, I think quite astutely in your piece, this sort of Trumpist populist wing of the Republican Party. One of the unfortunate side effects of the rise of this new style of Republican politics is that there's this emergence of a anti-little d Democratic sentiment in the party. If the Republican Party continues to double down on this approach, one can't help but wonder whether this creates the possibility for moderates and pro-little d Democrat Republicans to emerge. I think that's likely where we're going to see moderate politicians, right? This is rooted in an observation that the political scientist Liliana Mason has recently made. She's argued that polarization itself isn't the problem so much now. Instead, the real problem is a problem of democratization, where you have one party that appears to be committed to democracy as the only game in town, and one that appears to be less committed to democracy. And so I think the development of the Republican Party in the post-Trump presidency years might pave the way for the rise of the moderates that you discuss at length in your piece. Another question I had while reading the piece was, how does one go about cultivating a local distinct brand? So if you haven't read Stephen's piece, he talks about this quite a bit, and he points to 2 fairly prominent national Republicans, Larry Hogan and Charlie Baker, right? These sort of Republican Northeastern governors. He notes in his piece that these appear to be more lone wolves than really centers of a local party base. But I do think they're illustrative of a potential for a moderate to cultivate a local brand. My question here is whether these 2 gentlemen represent local brands distinct from their national partisan labels, or whether they're holdouts from a less nationalized period of our politics, right? If it's the case that they do have their own local brands, then perhaps we might encourage moderate politicians to emulate their strategies and their approach. But if it's the case that they're holdovers from a less nationalized era, then it's not clear to me what the best prescription is that we could offer for moderates seeking to gain political power. And so I think perhaps a more succinct way to put this is why is Joe Manchin still in the US Senate, right? Is it because he's an adept politician who can navigate being a Democrat in a Republican state, right? Or is it the case that West Virginia hasn't completed its process of nationalization and Joe Manchin will be the last of his kind? And so without a clear answer on that, I'm not sure how we go about developing strategies for cultivating local brands. And then the final thing I want to note on is I think perhaps most relevant to the arguments laid out in your piece. So and I agree with this completely, that, quote, the return to factional political parties with the potential to reinvigorate moderates is a scenario and not a certainty. It will not unfold purely on the basis of mechanical structural forces. Rather, its advent is contingent on creative, intelligent agency on the part of both organizations and individuals. And I think that's spot on. you go on to say that moderates lose out to, quote, wingnuts because those on the ideological extremes, to their credit, actually do the difficult long-term labor that democratic politics rewards. They show up, they organize, and they devote themselves to building durable institutions for political and intellectual combat. And so this got me thinking, how might moderates replicate that? How might they get the sort of foot soldiers, if you will, to go out and organize? And so a lot of my work is on anger in politics, and I can't help but wonder if we could think of an angry moderate, right? Traditionally, anger has been the purview of extremists and ideologues, right? It gets people interested in politics. It gets them participating, right? This is the psychological underpinnings of anger. It's an action-oriented emotion. So could a moderate replicate that strategy, right? One of the key things about anger is that people often perceive some person or group of people or some institution to be the source of their anger. And then they take an action against that which they perceive to have elicited their anger. So might an entrepreneurial moderate candidate say, hey, the problems with our society are these extremists that don't let anything, pass through legislatively in the halls of Congress. They're the reason you're suffering right now, right? Can you imagine a moderate anger precisely at extremists? Because if you can, that might give you a strategy for how a moderate could cultivate a local brand. It might get them the sort of foot soldiers they need to organize and mobilize to help them win elections. And then the final point on this is, while this might be possible, I think we need to think through the sort of trade-offs here, right? Anger causes us to sort of weaken in our commitment to norms that I think all of us prioritize and value. And so is it worth it to elect moderates if the strategy we need to elect moderates hurts us at a systemic level? I think you can think through a similar mechanism when we talk about the Republican Party's perhaps march away from democracy, right? If that creates an opening for moderate politicians to emerge, is it worth the cost? So anyway, I will end there. Really enjoyed the piece. It's quite thought-provoking, and so glad you were able to come and present it to us today.
All right, you want me to take just a couple minutes?
Thank you,
Okay.
Stephen.
Again, thank you.
Stephen, if you want to say a few things.
Okay, I'll be really quick. First of all, those are great.
Go ahead.
What? Do you hear me? Yeah. So yeah, those are great. I was actually anticipating something much more double-barreled. You clearly have a more civil culture at Indiana than we have at Hopkins. I was expecting, attacks on my parentage and whatnot.
We're not economists, so we're going to try to be a little polite here.
Yeah, well, there's lots of departments that are just, political scientists who are economists monkey. So let me go through really quickly some of these. One is the point about the, how big is this, right? With the Dsa faction, right? And is it a linear trend? One thing to say is that politicians respond not just to things in the present, but perceptions of the future, right? And perceptions of the future are, of course, manipulable, right? Again, we know that in the stock market, right? Everybody's making decisions not on the basis of what existing earnings. They're making decisions on the basis of projected earnings, right? And one thing we know, right, is even though the number of explicitly squad affiliated people is still relatively low, they went from 0 to that pretty fast, right? And people generally, while we as political scientists may sit there and rub our beards, and we both actually have beards, and and say, well, I don't know, this looks like a pretty small amount now, right? People generally tend to extrapolate, do straight line extrapolations, right? And again, lots of people have to make decisions on the basis of their rational expectations of where other things will be going in the future, right? That's why there's so much sort of trend chasing in politics, right? Because people have to make decisions, decisions in the present that will have consequences for them in the future. And so I think some of this is also, can be a self-fulfilling or a sort of a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy, right? One, you may see defections from the mainstream Democrats, right? Who say, I better get out of these people's way. It's better, it's better to to join up rather than to resist, right? So that's one possibility, is this is going to grow through conversion of existing members of Congress. And the other, right, is that people now are saying, look, you can win this way, right? We didn't think that you could go and win the way Cori Bush won, right? Or before that, AOC. But now this looks like, we have a sort of proven technology for how you do this, right? And that's going to give incentives for people to go and try and replicate it, right? And the more that's the case, it may be that there's incentives for leaders to recognize not just the existing strength of this faction, but what they perceive as their projected strength. So that's one kind of answer to it. I think the point building on, Lily Mason's work, I think is really interesting here. And it is the case that one of the things that causes the Republican Party to continue with its existing sort of, more or less populist strategy is that possibility of winning with 47% of the vote, right? If you had some of the, and I'm for and against some of those democracy reforms, it's a big grab bag of stuff, right? But if the overall consequence was to make our political system more majoritarian, right, then there would obviously be very strong incentives for the Republican Party to have to figure out ways to get to 50% instead of just to get to 47%, right? And to get to, that extra 3 or 4 or 5% is going to have to be in populations that are more difficult to make backward compatible with the Trumpy kind of strategy, right? I also think there's an argument that, and again, I'm obsessed with this point about the sort of state repression agenda of the next 5 years. But, a lot of that state repression agenda is going to be directed at the furthest out parts of the dominant populist nationalist, majority of the Republican Party, right? And that may potentially weaken them as well, right? So in that sense, the state apparatus may in fact be an ally of the liberal conservative faction against the populist faction. To go to the Hogan and Baker thing, yeah, so the argument here is that there's always been a strategy available for what I called before adult supervision republicanism, right? Again, Massachusetts and Maryland, had these enormous Democratic majorities, but at least a significant number of citizens are worried about what they'll do. It's like you leave the kid at the house and he's gonna, eat all the cookies, and he's gonna, not go to the bathroom where he's supposed to, right? So you need an adult supervision. This is sort of how Arnold Schwarzenegger won in California, right? And I think that lane is still open. The question is, and I think you're right, that right now that's a very individualistic strategy, right? It's a strategy about saying, I personally, Larry Hogan, can be the adult supervision, right? The question is, can you build off of that for something bigger than that, right? To say that actually there's an ideologically distinctive alternative faction available, right? And so when you're voting for me, you're voting for that, right? And one problem we've seen with people like Hogan, again, because it's so individualistic, they don't pull in other, members of the legislature. They don't go and like take over the party structure, right? Even in Maryland has a pretty Trumpy Republican Party, right? Because Hogan hasn't really tried to extend his own personal brand to control of the overall party brand, right? And I think that's where you really need larger systems of collective action, right? You need money, you need organization, you need all those other things in order to take it from idiosyncratic individual action to durable institutionalized collective action. And that's what I mean. What I mean by faction, right, is that durable institutionalized form of collective action. Okay, the last thing I'll do is talk about anger. I've thought about this a little bit. So I'm not a political psychologist. I'm more of a organization point. So I think about not action at the individual level as much as I think about action in collective forms. Now, again, collective forms of action build upon individual motivations, right? And that organizations need to find ways to motivate people's psychology in order to get them to participate in collective action, right? So these two things are not unconnected. I wonder whether it's rather than anger, it's fear, right? And I think in some ways what you were actually describing sounded to me more like fear than anger, right? It's more that if we don't get up off our ass, right, and organize and do something, right, that we're going to be, we're going to be governed by these people, right? And we don't want that, right? So we need to go and organize. Now, the other thing to say is, individual psychology is not the only building block of collective action, right? Most of collective action operates by activating existing forms of collective action. Aurelian, turn on your mute. Organizations build on existing forms of collective action, right? And then they motivate them for something else, right? So you think about the religious right. The religious right was not about just motivating things that were in people's individual brains, right? Is that the people actually had forms of collective action. They had churches, right? That got people, into ways of organizing with one another and creating public goods that then got activated and converted into party activity, right? And so one of the questions, therefore, for me is less to think about what is the psychological device that you can use to motivate moderation, as it is to think about what are the existing forms of organization that you can leverage into being the building blocks for this kind of factional organization. And so I think one of them is actually business, right? There are, a lot of business depend upon a reasonably functional government, just in order to make investments, in order to, to do their work, right? And I think there's an argument that really is a potential anchor tenant for both a liberal conservative faction in the Republican Party and a moderate faction in the Democratic Party, right? Different parts of it. I can get into who I think ends up where, but I think many of them already are afraid that the kind of governing dysfunction we have is making their basic profit-seeking enterprises hard to do, right? And that fear of just a sort of systemic governmental collapse can be a powerful motivation for people to take their existing forms of organization and activate them for party activity. So that's my
Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to give it the floor to two people at a time. So Jeff Isaac and Les Lenkowski first, and then I have Alexander Smith and Andrew Robertson on the list. So please feel free to raise your hand if you wish to be on the queue. Jeff and Les. Thank
you, Aurelian, and thank you, Stephen. It was a great talk, and I really like your book, as you know. So I have I think a pretty simple question. It's a kind of normative question, and it proceeds from, I think, the premise that, in fact, you introduced your talk with, which is your identification with Aurelian and moderation. So the question is this. I don't know if you've seen, Jonathan Chait yesterday published a piece in New York Magazine entitled GOP Congresswoman Blamed Wildfires on Secret Jewish Space Laser. And did you see the piece?
No, I haven't seen it.
Okay, that's cool. But it's basically, it's an evisceration of Marjorie Greene. And but it proceeds from a very short piece in Axios called The Mischief Makers that also came out yesterday. And in The Mischief Makers, Axios lists kind of the Congress people in the Democratic and Republican Party that are the most extreme. And the example for the Republicans is Marjorie Greene. The example for the Democrats is AOC, okay? And Chait is doing something very complicated in his piece rhetorically, but his basic point at the end is something like AOC believes in defunding the police and Medicare for all, and Greene believes in QAnon conspiracy theories and that a Jewish laser caused the fires. And then he says, obviously, basically he says you can be a lot, Democratic moderates are much more moderate than Republican moderates is his point. I'm wondering what you think of that, the way Axios likens AOC and Green. You chose to develop your account about how moderates could form primarily through talking about how Democrats can counter the left within the party. And I'm wondering if you think that there's actually symmetry or whether or not there's false equivalence. And the Republican Party is much more crazy, neo-fascist, and therefore much more troubling. And the real problem is what can happen within the Republican Party. AOC supports democracy. She was hiding, and Marjorie Greene supports marching on the Capitol. That's a big difference. I wonder what you think about that.
Les, thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Aurelian, and my thanks as well to both our paper presenter and discussant for great presentations. Steve Teles referred to an email discussion we had earlier this week. I had just finished reading his paper when the news that Senator Rob Portman was going to retire when that was announced. Senator Portman, of course, is probably a great example of a Republican moderate and a man with considerable experience in government, having served as a congressman and head of the OMB before being elected senator. And in announcing his decision to retire, he did not use the usual reasons, health or family, but basically said that this is a place where I can't do any work anymore, any legislation in Steve Teles's terms. So that led to the question, and I'll just put it up for everybody's benefit. Is there really a future for a moderate Republican faction in Congress if maybe one of the preeminent examples of a moderate Republican would rather retire than fight it out?
Yeah. Thank you, Les. Stephen.
Okay, so always good to see Jeff. Hi, Jeff. I'm trying to figure out how to answer Jeff's question. Jeff's question is a trap in the form of something sounds very generous, but in fact, it's a trap. So, I'm in the asymmetry camp, right? I do, my argument here again is that there are very different factional forces in each party, right? They're not reflections of one another, right? In some sense, as I say, they are interactive, right? In that things that are going on the Democratic Party do create openings for organization in the Republican Party, at least in particular places. And I think that's an important dynamic. There are people that we often think of on the left who believe things as crazy as the existence of a Jewish laser, right? Anybody who has been to Marin County knows who these people are, right? But interestingly, right, for the most part, those people and their crazy ideas about crystals and everything else don't have the same political salience that the people who believe in a Jewish laser do, right? And that, that's an interesting fact, right? Now, what do I make of it? So I was talking yesterday about how do we think about what it is that really differentiates these two parties, right? Especially if we think about them as not being symmetrical, right? And one of the things that really distinguishes the two parties is that you can think about the Democratic Party as to a significant degree as the party of professionals, right? That's part of what is going on in the 1970s, right? And again, when you go back to people who are talking about the new class, right, in places like the public interest, part of what they were catching, right, is that all these various different professions of various sorts were increasingly becoming both ideologically distinct, and as the Democratic Party was becoming more left of center and ideologically distinct from the Republicans, those professions were becoming part of that party coalition, right? And to some degree, that's the story I tell in the rise of the conservative legal movement, right? Is that the Democrats became the professional party, and as a consequence, to some degree, the Republicans became the anti-professional party, right? Because resistance to professions was also resistance to the power of the Democratic Party, right? That is where the Democratic Party, and if you think about a lot of Democratic Party policy, a lot of it is about giving more power to professionals, right? Of various kinds, right? And again, you just think about the conflicts we have over school reopenings, right? Are a reflection of the fact that the education profession is in the Democratic Party, and the Republicans don't have any of those teachers in it, and so you've got a natural kind of conflict. But it also means that that anti-professionalization, right, that anti-professional, anti-science, right, all those things are part of what the fundamental conflict in American politics is, right? So whereas the Republicans have less of a natural antibody to that nuttiness, right, that you're describing, right, because they're already organized in some powerful ways as the anti-professional party. The Democrats, on the other hand, right, have enormous amounts, right? All of the the nation's doctors and public health professionals and scientists, they're all in the Democratic Party, and they, as much as they are, they're liberals, they're also professionals, right? And I think they've got more of a incentive to push back against that, right, in their party than the Republicans have in theirs. Now, one way to think about that potential liberal conservative faction in the Republican Party is it's the faction of people who are the least anti-professional, anti-science, in some sense, anti-university, right? Those are the people who most want to send their kid to Princeton and Indiana and Hopkins and think of science in generally positive terms and everything else, right? And so you can imagine that also being one of the building blocks of that factional divide that I'm suggesting is emerging. Okay, quickly for Les's question. I mean, I do think I sort of gestured at this, right? That the dynamic we've seen is, right, that Rob Portman quitting is not the first time you've seen that, right? I think a lot of the previous retirements you've seen were all the kind of people who just say, look, this is not a fun job, right? This is not a satisfying job, right? I actually want to govern, right? Matt Gaetz has no interest in governing, right? There's no part of his own professional presentation of self that's associated with actually passing legislation, right? So the way Congress is organized now works perfectly well for him, right? But it works very poorly for people like Rob Portman. Now, again, and this is what I've been beating on for the last few years, right? That strategy of individualism does not work, right? You cannot, push back against this particular way of organizing Congress or organizing the Republican Party as an individual, right? As the person who just, presents himself as the more gentlemanly, face of the Republican Party. That's why all these people get systematically either knocked off or just give up, because they see the posse coming, right? That's why you actually need collective action, right? Because as a group, they're pivotal, right? As a group, there's nothing the Republican Party can do if they can actually say, you can't kill us all, right? You can't take us all out, right? But all of them, right? And that's partially, I think, is a kind of lag from a previous era of moderation where that did work, right? But now the Susan Collins all the way to the Rob Portmans actually have to say that only if we work together can we actually force changes on Congress that will allow us to govern and make this thing both a professionally satisfying place for us to be, but also an ideologically feasible place for us to be. So again, that's where my point goes back again, why the organizational dimension of this is so central as far as I'm concerned.
And that's a topic that is prominent in the published piece that everyone can read. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Les. Thank you, Stephen. I have on the list 3 people, just to remind you: Alex Smith, who is joining us from the University of Warwick in UK, Andrew Robertson and Hannibal Travis. I'm not sure whether Hannibal had a question that he wants to ask or just put it in the chat. But let's go for now with two questions from Alex Smith and Andrew Robertson.
Sorry, better unmute. Hi, Steve. I really appreciated that talk, and I actually have enormous sympathy with the general argument that you're making, actually. And as Aurelian, I apologize, as Aurelian knows, he and I are very much on similar pages when it comes to political moderation. And I've been engaged in a long study of the old moderate wing of the Kansas Republican Party, which is now gone. But I just wanted to make...
You're that Alexander Smith. Oh, okay.
Yes, I am.
I know exactly who you are.
Okay, so I have a couple of observations to make, which I'm making from the UK, but I grew up in Australia, which is another federal parliamentary system, which has undergone similar sorts of shifts as the United States, and sometimes for similar sorts of reasons culturally, in terms of the way parties are organized. But one general puzzle that I have consistently of American political science and the social sciences generally is the lack of interest there seems to be in exploring these dynamics of change at state legislature level. You make the excellent point that it's the religious right and the conservatives, etc., who take democracy seriously in terms of turning up on primary day and balloting and organizing and all the rest of it. But what we consistently overlook is the fact that they were doing that at the state level before they ever became a prominent force in national politics. And there's a big kind of gap here, I think, which I associate as a more general problem actually with the American political imagination, which does tend to reduce the struggle as being one between two presidential candidates or between two parties in Congress, and that is a failure to see how state legislatures and even forms of government below can provide building blocks for the kind of rebuilding that you're advocating. But one really key point, so that's my observation, but my key point is that there is a precedent for what you're talking about in terms of not angry moderates, but fearful moderates, and for mobilization by business. And that is the recent election in Kansas for governor, which saw Chris Kobach defeated. And that was very clearly a coalition of support for a Democratic candidate taking in moderate Republican constituencies as well as Democratic constituencies with a backbone from the business sector. Because like you say, business came to the view that we need a functioning government if we're going to have a functioning economy. And after the Sam Brown-backed tax cuts, the idea of Chris Kobach was just like taking, well, I mean, that just would have been a new kind of hell, basically. So there is a precedent, and I commend your sort of theory, if you like, with that precedent in mind. But I would urge folks to dig a bit deeper and take state politics seriously. This idea of local brands, it's a good idea. It's a good idea, but from the field work I've done, where Kansas Republican moderates had a local brand that sustained them for probably 2 decades after the national brand of moderate Republican really sort of fell apart. The problem they encountered is every time they tried to look more expansively for fellow travelers in other states and on the national stage, they came up dry. But there may still be some of that infrastructure in state legislatures around the country. And I know Jeff Cabaservice has written about elections in Oklahoma as well as Kansas, as recently as 2 election cycles ago. So I think there probably is some of that local infrastructure out there, but too often I think these conversations fail to get beyond, debates around Congress. And so therefore we're not even getting to the point of having the kind of conversation where these folks would have an entry point, to have the work that they do recognized as part of a nascent, factional organization. But apart from that, yes, I'm very strongly supportive of your general argument, and I really, really appreciated that.
Thank you, Alex. Andrew Robertson.
Hi, I'm on audio only. Can you hear me?
Yes, so go ahead.
Okay, I am calling from Columbus, Indiana, which isn't far from Bloomington. I heard the expression a couple of times, state repression, particularly toward the right, and it called to mind Herbert Marcuse's 1965 essay, Repressive Tolerance, which I just read. And as I was reading it, it seemed to me that that is exactly what the state is doing right now. That is his executing his idea of being open to the left and repressive of ideas from the right. I've also been reading about critical race theory, which is distinctly illiberal. It seems to me that if moderates are going to flourish in an environment where there is state repression, that repression might have to be aimed at both extremes and not just at one. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. Stephen, you have the floor, and then we have on the list Hannibal Travis and Michael Weinman. Thank you.
Okay. Alexander's points are absolutely, I agree with everything he said. They only gave me 30 minutes. So I gotta
Fair enough.
Again, I'm aware of Alexander's work. I recommend it to everyone here. You know, so Jeff Capaservice is at Niskanen. We've talked about Indiana a lot. You should write a book on this and you should publish it with my book series. So I am making you an offer here on this this Zoom call. I think that part of this I think gets to my hatred of moderate funders and how stupid they are and useless. That, you know, there's tons of people out there who are funding various different things that they associate with moderation, right? They're funding the bipartisan policy center. Jesus, the amount of money they get, right? You can think about all the other things, right? All the money that's been dumped into ranked choice voting, right? Which is all by people who are supposed moderates, right? You know, there's a whole lot of that stuff, right? And yet almost none of it has actually been put into actual organizing, right? Actually saying, you know, there are people out there who are trying to do this, right? Who are doing hand-to-hand combat in places like Kansas, right? Throw them a life, throw them, throw them a life preserver, right? Give them, you know, full-time staff so they can go out and prospect for members and do all the other things that organizers do, right? This at some point gets to the problem that the kind of people who are moderate funders, and Les will probably have an opinion on this because I'm making this up as I go along. These people don't think about funding in an organizational way, right? In fact, often I think they often tend to be slightly allergic to the idea of organizing, right? Partially because they can't necessarily, you know, control everybody who is going to be organizers, right? They're going to have to deal with a lot of, you know, even among various forms of more moderate or less, you know, I mean, like I actually scrubbed a lot of the reference to the term moderate in the last version of this because I'm slightly uncomfortable with it as a description of what the non-populist faction actually is. But I think one of the fundamental problems, and this is where, you know, to go back to Stephen's point earlier, I think there's a very important part of this. It's not structural and it's agency, right? It's that people made consequential decisions about political investment and the kind of things that Alexander is talking about for various incentives having to do with the preferences and organization of more moderate funders. That kind of activity has not been prioritized, right? And I think that's a big part of the explanation, you know, and again, I argued at the beginning of the Trump administration, right, that this is, you know, this is all the people who were upset about Trump needed to organize some organized structure, right? Whereas all the money went into center things, democracy promotion, all that other stuff, rather than specifically partisan activity, right? Including at the state level. So that's my spiel on that, right? So again, I mean something very specific about repression to where the second question is. So I've been thinking a lot about Christian Davenport's work, which up until now, people have read as like a a criticism of political repression. And I think a lot of that literature on political repression, people are now going to dust off as like a handbook rather than a warning. But I do think that, you know, again, if there was simply one really successful attack on a state capitol, right, it'll be very hard not to continually ramp up the repressive capacity of the state where that's concerned, right? We're already seeing some of that, right? But I think there's going to be strong incentives for that. And a lot of political activity, partisan activity, will organize around either support or opposition to that, right? Now, you know, and this is, it goes back to this symmetry point. I don't think these things are symmetrical, right? I do think, you know, I actually think there is an actual Antifa problem, right? I am a person who thinks, but I think it's more a problem for the self-interest of movements of the left, right? Antifa is basically a parasite, right? It's a parasite on actual social justice movements of the left, right? They're not doing, you know, most part, they have to attach themselves to genuine democratic, larger mass movements and assimilate and sort of, you know, operate around or inside of them, right? And so I do think that, you know, if the Biden administration was smart, you know, they would take, you know, policing that movement very seriously, simply as a way to open up space so that those larger social movements like Black Lives Matter, which I have a lot of criticisms of too, which we don't need to get into here, but I think that's an actual threat. But I don't think it's a social order threat. I think it's a social justice threat, which is different in the two parties. Okay.
Thank you. Hannibal and then Michael.
Yes, I had just posted mine in the chat, but it was basically about the first part of the talk about the Netherlands and whether US faction is more binary than in parliamentary systems and in other countries. And my question was whether it goes to other countries have laws guaranteeing third parties and primary candidates more equitable television access than we have. And the Supreme Court under the First Amendment and even under statutes has rejected that. And does that, you know, contribute to people not voting and the acrimonious two-party system we have? Thank you.
Michael?
Very briefly, it's a kind of a big question, and Stephen, you returned to this in your comment in terms of being more interested in the organizational elements and the collective action problems than the individual motivation and the political psychology. But I guess I just wanted to return to the question of the politics of anger and the politics of fear, and maybe make a plea, you know, a plea taking very seriously both the diagnosis and the prognosis that you offer for the future of moderate factions within a relatively homogenous party system, right, within our representative bodies, but a very heterogeneous, you know, sort of political ideological spectrum. And this mismatch causes big problems to maybe encourage further reflection now, later, about whether in fact it's anger or fear that's motivating, because I think from an empirical and diagnostic perspective, that imbalance or the asymmetry between the extremes, if they are, of the right and the left, have to do with the ways in which anger and fear are differentially motivating people. And that you can actually work with anger in a way that I think was your basic intuition, but you can't really work with fear. And there is no politics of fear, you know, in a moderate position, whether it's the liberal conservative or the moderate Democrat or whomever. But anger maybe could be mobilized. So both from the empirical and from the normative perspective, maybe it's worth investigating with a little more precision what it is in the anger fear matrix that's motivating and can be mobilizing.
Okay, thank you, Michael. This will be a question for both Stephen and Steve, and we're approaching the end of our event. So Steve or Stephen, whoever wants to go first. Stephen, why don't you go? Yeah.
I think we're both Stephen. So how about Webster goes first and then I can play cleanup.
Okay.
Well, I will keep it short, just because I would rather hear what our guest has to say about these things. I will note that I'm not sure I would agree entirely that anxiety or fear is not a workable emotion. I think if you wanted to use either of these emotions, both of which are what we would call a negative emotion, I think it depends what your goal is. So anger gets you off the sideline, so to speak. You'll show up at a protest or a rally, you'll donate money, you'll show up at the polls. That's obviously good for a candidate. Anxiety tends to cause people to seek out new information and question their beliefs, right? And so perhaps if you're trying to shake somebody who has proclivities towards an extreme out of those beliefs, you might want to make them fearful, and then they'll look at a more moderate solution to whatever the problem is. Anger has a different approach, right? It makes you sort of double down on what you know and believe. And so I think whether one takes an approach of using the psychological tool of anger versus anxiety depends on the goals you have. I think, again, just in terms of electoral pursuits, anger might be more useful. But if we're thinking about gathering information or questioning beliefs, then you would want to appeal to anxiety. And in fact, appealing to anger might be harmful for your goals.
Thank you, Stephen.
So again, I think especially for the undergrads who are on this call, I think it is interesting to just think about this conversation we're having in terms of the different ways that people analyze politics and what they think about, right? Again, there's a difference between people who study politics from an organizational point of view and the people who study what we call political behavior, which is really about political attitudes or political psychology. Again, I tend to think about the motivations for action as about activating other forms of collective action that people already have, right? So we all go all the way back to the civil rights movement, right? You know, the civil rights movement was really about activating people's existing forms of collective action, right? They were members of churches, right? They were, you know, students in schools, right? That's one thing we know about, you know, SNCC is they often had, you know, unbelievable participation in particular universities, right? Like everybody in the university basically participated, right? And so the point is, right, people are not individual automatons, right? Just with brains that have reactions, right? And then they either participate or they don't, right? They're connected in some way, right? And the question is, how do you leverage that connection, right? So the Republican Party is full of people who are connected, you know, you think about gun owners, right? Gun owners are not just individuals sitting there with a gun, right? You know, they go places, right? They have shooting ranges, they have other kinds of activities that link people together and then connect them into political action, right? Same thing with religious people have the same thing, right? Business people, right? Again, my grandfather in South Carolina, you know, was a businessman, and, you know, literally every week, you know, he had meetings with the other businessmen in town in Lake City, South Carolina, right? And that activity did also then manifest itself into political activity, but it was only partially, it was not exclusively political. In fact, it was not even a primarily political identity, but it was another kind of identity that got motivated for political activity, right? So when I think about this problem, and again, it isn't an either or to think about the way that the other Stephen or me think about this, but I do think there are different ways of thinking about what are the bases of political participation or activity, right? When I think about this problem, I think less about what's the psychological trigger that we need to look for, but what is the untapped form of or existing organization that you can build upon or leverage to generate political activity, right? And so for me, that's the most important question. And that's the thing I'm thinking about for both of these factions. Now, again, you may need to find psychological triggers to help activate that form of collective action, right? But the building block is not going to be atomized individuals. The building block is going to be people who already have some social structure connecting them, right? Rather than people who are just sitting in their, you know, in their living room on their couch, right? Who then either respond or don't respond to a kind of appeal given with one kind of affect or another.
Thank you, Stephen. Our time is up. I would like to take a special moment to thank all of you for joining us and ask you to give a round of electronic applause to both our speakers, Stephen Teles and Stephen Webster. Thank you both. And I would like to remind you that the Tocqueville program will continue its events this semester. Our next event will be on February 12th, and then we will be hosting Professor George Thomas from Claremont McKenna College, who will be talking about James Madison. Thank you to everyone today. Thank you, Stephen, for your excellent presentations. Thank you, Stephen, for your excellent response. And stay healthy and take good care of yourself. And thank you to our hosts, the Ostrom workshop. As always, thank you, David and Alison. Goodbye now.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Bye. Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.